Daniel Krawisz is a master's student at UT Austin studying software engineering and is writing his first book, Crypto Anarchy: Freedom in the Computer Age. Daniel, thanks for joining me today. How are you?
Very good. How are you?
I am doing well. So we're sitting here. It is October 22nd, about 10:02 a.m. The markets are totally exploding. I've been watching over the last couple of hours the price go up about $20. Do you think that we're in another bubble, or do you have any idea of what's going on with markets right now?
Well, let's not call it a bubble. Let's call it hyper monetization, because that's really what's happening. Bitcoins are taking over the world. Maybe not tomorrow, but as more people join into the big Bitcoin family, it just makes Bitcoin more enticing for other people. But I mean, I expect we'll see some extreme volatility pretty soon. But, you know, if you just think back to April, really all that happened was not a bubble. The price went way up and then it corrected. But in the end, it stabled around a point that was significantly higher than where it began.
So there have been people who have been, since kind of the beginning of this, saying that Silk Road and a lot of these, I don't know if the word is illicit, but less legitimate, less tax-paying businesses sort of use, actually casts a negative light on Bitcoin as a whole. And so simultaneously, as we saw what's been going on with Silk Road, we had the price go down and then the price go back up. So, I mean, what's happening here?
Yeah, well, first of all, as to illicit businesses, I think that we shouldn't try to make Bitcoin appear more acceptable to the mainstream, because Bitcoin is so great, it sells itself. They're going to be wanting Bitcoin very soon anyway, even if they think it has a bad impression today. The amazing thing that happened with the markets is that, the news came out that the Silk Road had been taken down. The price crashed for like 2 hours, and then it was almost right back to where it was. And it took about a week for it to go right back to the same level. What that shows is that the people who were buying Bitcoins then had a much more long-term vision for Bitcoin than as simply something to buy drugs with online over the Silk Road. They knew that there would be more versions, better versions of the Silk Road that are coming out. And they also knew that all sorts of other things are possible with Bitcoins. And the destruction of this one company has really no long-term meaning for Bitcoin. Although we really need to honor the Silk Road as an amazing achievement that, and Bitcoin couldn't be where it is today without it. But however, now Bitcoin is so strong that we don't need it.
So early on, it acted as a bootstrapping mechanism because it gave us, it's not us, but generally speaking, it gave, something that you could do with Bitcoin that you couldn't necessarily do with anything else. But right now, we've passed the point. It's served its purpose. It's catalyzed whatever it needed to catalyze, and now we've moved past that, so it doesn't matter anymore, right?
Right. And now we're actually starting to see some legal businesses that use Bitcoins in ways that let them do all kinds of things that you can't do with credit cards. So it's not just, add Bitcoins as a payment option. We're getting new businesses that can only do what they do because of Bitcoins. There was this Cointagion ebook store that I learned about from your podcast. That's one of the things I saw. And then there's this new site, I don't remember what it's called, but it lets you do video game gambling, which is fantastic.
Yeah, there's one called LeetCoin that's doing that, and I think there are 2 or 3 other projects that are going in that same way. That is a really interesting point. There are a lot of these problems that have just been problems for the longest time, and now through Bitcoin, it seems like people are finding ways to solve them.
Yeah.
So, Daniel, people come to Bitcoin for different reasons and kind of through varied means. How did you find yourself learning about and then writing and speaking about cryptocurrency?
Since about 2005, I've been an anarchist, Rothbardian, anarcho-capitalist. That means that I was a gold bug, and I wanted all the money to be replaced by gold-based currency. So I first learned about Bitcoin in 2010, and there was no Mt. Gox and not much of anything. It did have a price at that point. The pizza sale had happened. I remember on this website that I read about it, there was around 6 things that were listed that you could buy with it, and I was like, what is this? This is ridiculous. But then it was around the beginning of the 2011 mania that really convinced me that there was something to Bitcoin, because I could see that it was behaving a regular commodity, and it had all sorts of properties that gold bugs should like if they thought about it a little bit. That's when I first took the plunge, and I got a little bit, and I'm very happy with that. But I wish I had got into mining around 2011. That's what the really smart people were doing. But now I'm trying to get involved with Bitcoin businesses. That's what the smart people are doing today, I think.
We just returned from the cryptocurrency conference in Atlanta, and was that your first Bitcoin event?
Yes.
So what was your impression of it? I mean, it was a more libertarian flavored event than some of the other ones we've attended for Let's Talk Bitcoin, but I think that it was a really interesting crowd.
I really loved how it was organized. There, you had all kinds of different people with different perspectives. So there really needs to be a better merging between the libertarian groups and the technological computer science cryptography groups, because they're really very natural allies. And actually, I just went to the Students for Liberty conference in Dallas last weekend, and they didn't have none of the speakers mentioned Bitcoins. It was on everybody's mind. They didn't know enough about it, though. So I was there. I mean, it was weird because this was sort of the first time I've been anywhere where everybody wasn't already talking about Bitcoins constantly for a long time. So that helped remind me that there's still a lot of people who need to understand what's going on.
So earlier in our conversation, you said that you believe in anarcho-capitalist principles. You know, compared to libertarianism, can you explain to me what some of those differences are?
Okay, well, I would say that libertarians are basically anarcho-capitalists who haven't thought things through to their logical conclusion. Libertarians believe in private property and are against the initiation of coercion against other people and their property. Now, I should say that doesn't mean that you can't have socialist communities or worker cooperatives. The important thing really is just that property is originally owned by individuals, and groups and organizations are created by their voluntary decisions. So anarcho-capitalists simply take this idea and apply it to all industries. Many libertarians will say that police and courts and national defense are legitimate functions of the state, whereas the anarcho-capitalists would say that none of these are, and they can all be produced privately via a for-profit business model or some kind of charity model or some sort of cooperative model. There are all kinds of options available, but the point is that they need to be provided privately with organizations created by voluntary association, not through the state.
In anarcho-capitalism compared to libertarianism, at least in these general terms we're talking about here, you could say that libertarians believe in a minimal government that is a government as we know it today, providing basic services, whereas anarcho-capitalists do not believe in any sort of government that's not local.
Well, anarcho-capitalists would still call themselves libertarians. The people who believe in minimal government are called minarchists, and the people who believe in no government are called anarchists. And together, libertarian encompasses both groups.
So now, the imagery that often comes up when talking about anarchism or people who identify as anarchists is that of the bomb-throwing anarchist. And it seems like that's like an offensive stereotype, but really besides that, it doesn't seem to play much with any of the characters that we come into contact with identifying by that. How do you think that happened?
Well, my understanding is that in the early 20th century, some of the anarchist groups did decide that violence might be an effective strategy for promoting their goals. And that has since then, that has produced this stereotype, has been a bad mark on the anarchist movement ever since. In general, I would say that anarchists are very peaceful people, and they don't believe that violence is going to be effective in promoting a free, peaceful, stateless society. Of course, I promote Bitcoin as a great means of promoting anarchy. I don't think it's going to be enough on its own, but it can take great strides towards reducing the power of the state. And of course, Bitcoin is completely peaceful. What we can see with the Silk Road, that there was none of the violence that you normally think about when you imagine the drug industry, except, of course, when the police actually got involved and started investigating Ross Ulrich.
So you're writing a book called Crypto Anarchy, Freedom in the Computer Age, and you also started a club called the Crypto Anarchy Club at UT Austin, where you attend. You know, you mentioned that you promote Bitcoin as a means of promoting anarchy or decentralization. How do those two things fit together, and how is Bitcoin a tool, or cryptocurrency a tool that's relevant to this movement?
Nassim Taleb, the philosopher and investor, has a concept called anti-fragility. That's something that gets stronger when you try to attack it. It rearranges itself into something that's less vulnerable every time you try to hurt it. That's what Bitcoin is. It's a network of people who are all very enthused about it and who want to make it work, and where each of them has the ability to make small contributions that all add on top of each other. Bitcoin is so useful that it's like a universal acid. It sort of absorbs everything that you can throw at it. It makes it quite easy for people to resist the government and to create organizations that are similar to everyday businesses, but which are also able to evade government oversight. And of course, the Silk Road is a great example. Now there are lots of other competitors, and people are even talking about even better versions of the Silk Road that don't have a central point of failure. This idea of the online anonymous drug bazaar is here to stay, and it's an enormous advance above what we had previously. So that's an example of how Bitcoin allows people to evade the government. But ultimately, Bitcoin is like super cash. It's like cash, but a lot better in many ways. And of course, as long as you can avoid going through the banking cartel, that alone gives you a huge edge in how easily you can resist the government's orders.
The anti-fragile concept is a really interesting one, and as we've been watching what's been going on with the Silk Road and then watching the price as it relates to that, I mean, like I said at the beginning of this interview, the price had just peaked about $200, which is a point we hadn't been at, I think, in the last 4 or 5 months. It really has made me wonder if maybe we've passed that tipping point in the anti-fragile cycle. Because, I mean, the whole concept behind anti-fragile is like you punch something, and if it isn't destroyed entirely, then it is more resistant to future impacts that are the same, because it learns from those impacts. So are we now at the point in the cycle where there has almost no negative impact whatsoever, and in fact doing something that should cause a detrimental effect actually just causes a positive effect?
Well, I mean, I think that Bitcoin was always anti-fragile, but right now what we're seeing is that the people who own Bitcoins now understand that. And that's what we've seen for the past few months is they've been buying into any weakness, and if anything bad happens, it doesn't matter because they know that at the long term, Bitcoin can overcome. People are so much less nervous now than they were earlier this year even. But I think that they were wrong to be nervous earlier this year. You know, lots of people were saying, oh, the government is going to shut Bitcoin down. And that really wasn't a realistic fear at any point. Now, if the government really tried to shut Bitcoin down, they might be able to do it, but they don't seem to understand what the threat is. And very, very quickly, it's going to become more and more difficult for them. In Austrian economics, there are these conjectural histories about the origin of money. What this means is you try to think about the most general possible story about how money came into existence. In other words, you're trying to think of some sequence that should apply to every possible instance of the creation of money. That includes all the varieties of human behavior. What's the lowest common denominator for the story of money? There are two basic issues. The idea of how a medium of exchange becomes money, and then there's the idea of how a good, which is not a medium of exchange, becomes a medium of exchange. And both of these are independent. So once you have a medium of exchange, it really doesn't matter how it got to that point for how it's going to become money. So the way this happens is there are maybe several media of exchanges, none of which is, well, first of all, I should give a definition of money. Usually money is defined as a medium of exchange which is the most marketable, the most accepted on the market. There are several other definitions, but they all are roughly this. It's the biggest medium of exchange, the one that almost everybody is using.
So the network effect plays a big role in making money money.
That is the answer. Just think about if you have two media of exchanges which are both equally marketable. In other words, everybody is indifferent as to whether you pay in medium A or medium B, say gold and silver. They both like either one. If either one even gets a tiny edge over the other, that actually makes it superior as a medium of exchange, because a more marketable medium of exchange is better because there's more you can buy with it. A tiny edge of one medium of exchange over another should be expected to produce a positive feedback, and eventually the medium with the slight edge should grow to have an enormous edge. And ultimately, one should emerge as money.
So when we're talking about small advantages and causing one particular one to emerge as money versus not, this is because the fact that they are exchangeable is what makes them valuable. Once they've so there's a threshold where it has to be a medium of exchange in order to be considered for this. But once it is a medium of exchange, how it got there is irrelevant. But so long as it's in that category, how useful it is determined by how many people are using it, in much the same way that a language is determined by how many people are using it.
That's a very, very good analogy. And we can see that with languages in the world, that languages which are widely used become more widely used. They become trade languages, the common tongue for lots of different people. But the reason this story is important is initially a lot of Austrians didn't like Bitcoin. They're actually coming around now, but they didn't like Bitcoin because it's kind of weird for them. They're used to thinking about gold. But what they could have observed is that Bitcoin is already a medium of exchange, so it could become money, and there's really no reason that it shouldn't. The earlier story about how a good becomes a medium of exchange, the good must have demand. In other words, it must have a price before it's a medium of exchange. That's the essential principle. There must be some reason that people want it before they're using it to buy things. So with gold, that's pretty obvious. Gold is good for jewelry, and if they had electronics thousands of years ago, it could have been good for that too. But people like gold for reasons other than as money. But the confusing thing about Bitcoin is that it appears to be good only as a medium of exchange and not actually good for anything else. That's the fallacy. That's how it looks. You have to think deeper to see the answer. And really the answer is just that even if it is not used as a medium of exchange, it has investment value to people who think, well, one day maybe it will be a medium of exchange. And if it is, oh boy, I'm going to be rich. And that's just what we see in history, is that originally Bitcoins had no price at all. People were just mining them and playing around with them like toys. But then some people started to seriously think about if Bitcoins became money. The very first exchanges of Bitcoins for dollars were to people who just wanted to have some, just in case, just based on that remote seeming possibility. I mean, if you can get 10,000 Bitcoins for $1, something like that, why not, And then once that tiny base of demand, that could be built upon step by step. Eventually, people started seeing Bitcoin businesses. Each step in the process builds upon the previous. So once there are more businesses, then it seems more likely that Bitcoin is going to become money in the future. So then there's more investment demand. And once there's more investment demand, then Bitcoin can actually be used for more trade. In other words, you get the picture.
Right. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle after a reasonably short period of time. You mentioned that where all money is equal. So in your earlier example, you said silver and gold. I'm wondering, though, isn't Bitcoin's value derived more from the fact that it's actually easier to use as money than something like silver or gold because it doesn't have that liability of physicality?
I would say ultimately the demand for Bitcoin is still more investment demand than demand to use it as money right now. The reason there's investment demand is people who examine it can see that it is better than gold in a lot of ways. Bitcoins actually take the advantages of dollars and gold and sort of combine them and have none of the defects. Gold has the problem that it's physical and requires a big banking infrastructure to use as money. And of course, you need money substitutes for everyday transactions. And that leads to the problem of fractional reserve banking. You don't have that with Bitcoins. Whereas the advantage of dollars is that they can be transferred around the world because dollars are no longer physical. Of course, Bitcoins are much better at that. You still have to go through a ridiculous banking system to transfer dollars, but dollars do have that advantage over gold. So yes, anyway, the investment demand for Bitcoin derives from the fact that they are superior to gold and dollars as money.
But ultimately, it's still very speculative at this point, more so than it is people using.
Yes.
Fair enough. So, Daniel, wrapping this up, the first time you and I spoke, it was over BitMessage about an article you wrote on altcoins.
I think it's totally fine if you want to play around with the code and, tweak some parameters, experiment and incorporate your own ideas. But if you are telling me that your new altcoin is going to be the next big thing and it's going to be equal or greater than Bitcoins, or even a small shadow compared to Bitcoins, I think that's disingenuous. And if you really believe that, you're lying to yourself. There's really no reason to expect that any altcoin can beat Bitcoins in the market just because of the network effect. Now, if you come up with an altcoin that improves upon Bitcoin in some way, Bitcoin can compete by incorporating that improvement into itself. It can also compete just by having so much larger of a user base that any small improvement that you might have made in your altcoin isn't good enough. If you wanted to create an altcoin that was actually going to beat Bitcoin, you would have to make something that's as great an improvement over Bitcoin as Bitcoin is over the dollar. So you're not going to accomplish this by tweaking some parameters. You'll have to come up with an idea that's as amazing and innovative as Satoshi's original idea. So let me just quick suggest the conditions under which you should invest in an altcoin. It's possible that an altcoin could survive if it can do things that Bitcoin can't do. In that case, it will serve a very specialized purpose. It will only do that one thing. So if there is an altcoin like that, and you think that this altcoin is further away from its potential as Bitcoin is from its potential, then you could get this altcoin. But there really isn't anything like that at all. Now, name coins kind of do something interesting because in addition to being a currency, they are attempting to be a distributed domain name recognition service. And the way name coins work is that you have to use name coins to pay for your distributed domain. At least that is my understanding. If name coins, if the .bit addresses become popular, then you would expect name coins to play a very tiny specialized role in the Bitcoin economy. So that would possibly be something that might be worthwhile. However, it should still be seen as a disadvantage that the .bit addresses have to use name coins rather than Bitcoins. If someone came up with a distributed domain system that was built on top of Bitcoins, that would be a better system. And I believe that Invictus Innovations is working on something like that.
I think the project is called Quixote. So mostly it sounds like you basically need to reinvent the wheel, right? Is that if you're going to have a successful altcoin, you can't just stand on the shoulders of what's come before. You have to actually create something that solves a problem that's not fixed by other things. One of the things we've been talking about is the idea that as Bitcoin gets larger, it actually becomes harder to implement new things into it, because since so many people have money tied up in it, and since the development team is basically volunteers, there's a lot of reticence about messing with parts like wallet software, for example. There hasn't been a lot of innovation in Bitcoin wallet software at the core level because there's concern that if something goes wrong, it's going to cost people real money.
There are certain improvements that could be made to Bitcoin that will probably never be made because of this problem. If there's something that is going to make Bitcoin not work, that'll get fixed. But there are some inefficiencies that may remain that we'll just have to live with, possibly. So one thing that people sometimes worry about is decentralization of mining, some aspects of the way mining works. That's probably something, I think that's an overblown fear. I agree that there are potential problems, but that's probably something that will never improve. Now, wallets, there are actually all kinds of different wallets that you can make. There hasn't been a lot implemented with that, but you can have two-factor wallets, and of course that's only the beginning. You can have wallets that behave in all kinds of interesting ways. Well, one thing I'd like to mention is that we had this big jump in the price of Bitcoins over the past couple of weeks. This has not been reflected in the Litecoin price. In fact, over the past couple of months, Litecoin has been gradually moving downwards. It did not jump with Bitcoins this week as it did in April. So I think that suggests that people are beginning to understand that these altcoins are kind of a sham, and it's going to be Bitcoin or nothing, essentially.
Daniel Krawisz, thank you very much for joining us on Let's Talk Bitcoin.
Thank you very much.
EasyDNS is the Swiss Army knife for your domain names, helping meet their customers' individual needs since 1998. EasyDNS has been an outspoken critic of SOPA and CISPA. EasyDNS was an early supporter of Bitcoin, and now they are proud to sponsor this show. Do business with a company that shares your values. Get a 13% discount when you pay with Bitcoin. Go to bitcoin.easydns.com and be sure to use discount code LTB.